The night was hot, stuffy, and the room lit by the golden light of the chandeliers reflected smiles, glasses clinking and bodies moving to the sound of lively music. I was there, standing in the doorway, wearing an outfit that was supposed to make me look confident, but inside I felt an oppressive heat in my chest, as if the air had been knocked out of the room. The gleam in her eyes hit me like a blade, and the way her hand rested casually on his arm made my stomach turn. They tried to hide it, but their rigid bodies and the looks they exchanged gave everything away. She froze when she saw me, as if she had been caught in the act, and her lover took a step back, like a cornered wolf. For a moment, I thought my presence there might be a nightmare, something born of the sleepless nights and distressing thoughts that had been haunting me for weeks. But it wasn't a dream. It was real. The betrayal was there, exposed, open before everyone's eyes. She tried to compose herself, to open a smile that looked more like a broken mask. "What are you doing here?" Her voice sounded weak, shaky, but filled with a false normality. And it was at that moment that I knew, there was no going back. "Congratulations, you screwed up," I said, and each word felt like poison spilling from inside me. "Now you can continue your life alone. You don't come into my house anymore." The silence that followed was piercing. I could hear her heavy breathing and the uncomfortable murmuring of the people around her, but nothing seemed as loud as the echo of those words coming out of my mouth. She tried to reach for my hand, but I backed away. "Wait, it's not what it seems," she insisted, but her lover was already moving away, as if looking for a discreet exit. "You don't understand, I can explain." Anger burned in my eyes as I stared at her, and in that moment I knew I didn't want to hear any explanations. There was not enough justification to destroy years of trust, companionship and love. Not after everything I had done to build that life with her. I turned to leave, but something in her expression made me stop. It wasn't guilt or regret. It was fear. Fear not of losing myself, but of losing something bigger, something she wasn't ready to admit. I turned around again, staring at her as if I could get the truth out of her right there, in the middle of that stifling room full of strangers. It was then that I realized. She was scared because she knew she had more to lose than just her marriage. Something about that exchange of looks between her and her lover sent a chill down my spine. There were more secrets hidden there, something I hadn't discovered yet. Her words stumbled as she tried to mend what was already irreparably broken. "He's just a friend, someone I work with. We were discussing a project, and I didn't want you to know because I thought you wouldn't understand." But the lover's look told another story. He wasn't just a friend. He was running away like someone who knew exactly what he had done and now feared the consequences. I felt a rush of adrenaline wash over me. My fingers were clenched into fists, my breathing was shallow, and everything in me was screaming to get out of there. But at the same time, a part of me wanted to stay and see how far this lie would crumble. I wanted to hear every justification, every excuse, and watch as she desperately tried to plug the holes in a story that no longer held up. "If he's just a friend, why is he leaving?" I asked, pointing to the man who was already almost at the door. "Why did you freeze when you saw me? Why does he seem more concerned about saving himself than protecting you?" She swallowed hard, and at that moment I knew the mask had fallen. There was no more pretending. The curious and judgmental looks of people at the party made me feel even more exposed, but they also gave me strength. If I couldn't trust her, then I would make sure to show her that I was no longer the naive, complacent man she thought I was. "You screwed up, and now you have to deal with the consequences." As I left the party, the echo of murmurs and glances still burned behind me, but what really tormented me was her gaze. It wasn't just fear of being discovered. It was something deeper, darker. Something I still hadn't fully understood. And that's what made me stop on the sidewalk, take a deep breath and decide that this story was far from over. Because there was something more. Something they were hiding. Something that could change everything. And I was determined to find out what it was. Welcome to the channel where shocking stories come to life. Here, we do not support any type of betrayal. Our stories are fictional, but they carry a powerful message. Betrayal destroys lives and leaves scars that not even time can erase. Get ready to dive into an intense narrative, full of secrets, twists and deep emotions. Take a deep breath, because this story will move you. The first rays of sunlight broke through the room's light curtains, filling the room with a soft, golden light. The morning announced another ordinary day in the lives of Daniel and Laura. The alarm clock rang, but he was already awake, staring at the ceiling like he did almost every morning. Laura slept next to him, her hair spread out on the pillow, breathing slowly and calmly. He watched for a few seconds before carefully getting up so as not to wake her. Daniel liked these moments of silence, when he could reflect on everything they had built together. The house, the plans, the shared dreams. He was proud of what they had, even if, lately, something invisible seemed to hover between them, like an empty space that he couldn't name. In the kitchen, the smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the air as he prepared breakfast. He had a habit of leaving a cup ready for Laura before she woke up. He had always done this, since the first months of marriage. It was a way of showing affection without needing words. She came downstairs soon after, wearing a light robe, her eyes still sleepy. She smiled when she saw him and thanked him for the coffee, giving him a quick kiss on the cheek before sitting down at the table. They talked about the day's plans, little everyday things, but there was a slight tension in the air that Daniel couldn't ignore. It wasn't anything explicit, just that nagging feeling that something wasn't right, although he didn't know exactly what. Laura had always been a vibrant woman. She worked as an architect and loved her work, something that often mixed with her personal life, as she was constantly involved in projects, events, and meetings. Daniel admired her dedication and energy, but lately she seemed to be more distracted. She said it was because of an important new project, and he believed her, because he trusted her. They had been together for almost 10 years and had been through so much that he refused to think anything could be wrong. After all, wasn't that what happened to couples after being together for so long? The routine settled in, the shine diminished a little, but the love remained. That's how he saw things. Despite the love he felt for Laura, Daniel couldn't ignore the growing feeling that they were growing apart. He worked as a manager at a technology company, a stable and well-paid position, but one that required long hours and occasional travel. He tried to compensate for his absence with simple gestures, such as dinners prepared at home or surprises on special dates, but sometimes he felt that this was no longer enough to rekindle the flame between them. Laura looked pleased, but there was something in her eyes that he couldn't decipher. A different glow, perhaps from tiredness, perhaps from something deeper. He preferred not to ask, afraid of the answer. Their social life was busy. Laura loved parties and events, and Daniel made a point of accompanying her whenever he could, even if he preferred quieter nights. Friends saw them as the perfect couple, always smiling, always together, but Daniel knew that no one knew the little cracks that formed when the lights went out and the smiles disappeared. It was in these moments, in the solitude of his room, that he wondered if he was doing everything right. If he was still the man Laura needed. On this particular morning, Laura seemed especially rushed. He said he had an important meeting and would need to leave early. Daniel watched her as she got ready in her room, carefully choosing her clothes, perfume, and accessories. She had always been vain, but there was something different about the way she prepared herself lately. More attention to detail, more care. He tried to ignore the thoughts that started to arise, telling himself that he was just being paranoid. After all, Laura had always been careful about her appearance, especially when she had presentations for important clients. She hurried away, giving him a quick kiss and promising that she would be back early for dinner. Daniel stood there, standing in the doorway, watching her leave, feeling an uneasiness growing in his chest. He tried to distract himself with work, but his mind kept going back to her, to the last few months, to the little changes he preferred not to question. He decided it was time to do something to rekindle the relationship. Maybe a surprise trip or a romantic dinner. He needed to remind her, and himself, of everything they had built together. When Laura returned home that night, she was more excited than usual. He talked about the project and how things were going well, but Daniel felt there was something forced in his excitement. She smiled, touched his arm affectionately and asked him how his day had been, but the conversation soon turned to trivialities. As they ate dinner, he tried to ignore the feeling that there was a growing distance between them, something that no words or gestures seemed able to bridge. In the days that followed, Daniel made a conscious effort to get closer to Laura. They started going out more often, having dinner out, watching movies together, but the restlessness inside him didn't disappear. There were moments when she seemed completely present, looking at him as she had in those early years, but there were others when she seemed distant, as if she were somewhere else, thinking about something else. He wondered if he was imagining all of this, if it was just the result of the stress of work or the irrational fear of losing what they had. One day, while organizing some papers in his home office, Daniel found a business card in Laura's coat pocket. The name didn't sound familiar to her, but the title indicated it was someone from the corporate world, perhaps a client or partner on the project she was working on. He tried to ignore the pang of jealousy he felt and decided to ask her about the card later, but when he finally brought it up, Laura laughed and said it was just a professional contact, someone she had discussed ideas with for the project. Daniel smiled and pretended to be satisfied with the answer, but something inside him was still uncomfortable. That night, while Laura slept next to him, Daniel stayed awake for hours, reliving every conversation, every detail of the last few months. I tried to find rational explanations for the little signs I had ignored, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized that maybe I was right to feel like something wasn't right. Still, he refused to confront her directly. I wanted to believe that everything could be resolved, that they just needed time to reconnect. However, something changed within him. Daniel realized that, for the first time in years, he was beginning to doubt Laura. He didn't want to admit it even to himself, but the feeling was there, persistent and uncontrollable. And that doubt began to grow, silent and dark, threatening to destroy everything he believed about the love and trust they shared. Daniel spent the next few days trying to ignore the restlessness growing inside him. He tried hard to keep his routine intact, focusing on work and the small interactions with Laura that seemed, at least on the surface, normal. But behind the mechanical gestures and forced smiles, something seemed to be slowly disintegrating. He started paying more attention to the details, to her departure and arrival times, to the quick messages on her cell phone that she disguised as work appointments. He tried to push away the thoughts that were gnawing at him, but it was like fighting the tide. Every day, he felt more distant from her, as if the woman he had shared so many moments with was becoming someone he barely knew. Dinners began to be hurried, conversations interrupted by messages that demanded immediate responses. Laura justified it with tight deadlines and unexpected meetings, and Daniel tried to accept it, but doubt accompanied him in silence. One night, after yet another dinner where her cell phone vibrated repeatedly on the table, he finally asked if something was wrong. Laura smiled, but the smile didn't reach her eyes, and assured that everything was fine, just pressure at work. Daniel wanted to believe it, but there was something about the way she looked away that made him even more uneasy. The nights also began to change. Laura no longer looked for him like she used to. She claimed tiredness, headaches, but spent long minutes locked in the bathroom, her cell phone always nearby. Daniel could hear the water running, but his mind imagined conversations that were perhaps happening behind that door. He tried to ignore it, he tried to trust, but the void between them only grew. He began to feel like a stranger in his own home, as if he were watching the collapse of something that had previously seemed solid. He looked at her and wondered when everything started to change, when it stopped being enough. The pressure finally built up to the point where Daniel decided he needed to know the truth. One night, while Laura was taking a shower, he took her cell phone. He felt his heart racing, his hands sweating as he scrolled through the messages. He found professional conversations, messages from friends, but nothing that confirmed his suspicions. For a moment he felt relieved, almost ashamed for doubting her. But then, at the bottom of the list, he found a name he didn't recognize. The messages were frequently deleted, but some were still there, short, ambiguous, filled with a tone that made him freeze inside. Photos of casual encounters, inside jokes, vague phrases that seemed innocent to anyone who wasn't paying attention, but Daniel knew. That name wasn't just a professional contact. When Laura came out of the bathroom, she found Daniel sitting on the edge of the bed, his cell phone in his hands and a look in his eyes that she didn't recognize. He asked directly who the person she was exchanging messages with was. Laura hesitated for a second, and that was enough for him to know. She tried to explain herself, saying he was just a friend, someone who made her laugh in difficult times, but Daniel didn't believe her. Her voice was shaking, her words sounded rehearsed, and the panic in her eyes said more than any excuse. He threw his cell phone on the bed and left the room before she could continue talking. In the following days, Daniel struggled to remain calm, but distrust had already taken over him. Laura continued to act as if nothing had happened, trying to regain normality, but every smile and touch seemed empty. He began to notice the most elegant clothes, the strongest perfumes, the schedules that never coincided. Every detail was like a silent blow, fueling the certainty that something was happening. Worst of all was the feeling of helplessness. He didn't want to confront her again without concrete proof, but the weight was slowly destroying him. Then, on a Friday night, Laura said she would need to attend an important work event. He apologized for not being able to take Daniel, claiming that it was only for guests from the sector. He accepted, but something inside him prevented him from letting the matter drop. He decided he needed to know the truth and, against every instinct telling him to forget it, he followed Laura that night. He stayed in the car, watching from a distance as she entered the salon elegantly dressed, with the kind of care he hadn't seen in months. For a while, he thought about giving up, going home and pretending nothing was wrong. But then, he saw something that made his blood run cold. Laura was not alone. She was greeted by a man who hugged her in a way no coworker would. Daniel felt his heart race, his mind racing to process what was before his eyes. They smiled, talked closely, and, in a moment that seemed to unfold in slow motion, he saw her holding his hand as they walked into the room. Daniel felt as if the floor had disappeared. Each piece of the puzzle finally fell into place, but the picture formed was devastating. He got out of the car, crossed the parking lot and entered the salon, driven by a mixture of anger, pain and an uncontrollable need to confront the truth. The music and lights seemed distant as he roamed the crowded space, looking for them. He found them in a more private corner, talking as if the world around them didn't exist. Laura saw him first, and the panic in her eyes confirmed everything he already knew. She tried to move away, but he continued walking until he stopped in front of her. The lover took a step back, and Laura opened her mouth to speak, but he didn't give her the chance. He said in a firm, cutting voice that she had destroyed everything. He said she could live her life alone because she no longer went into his house. The silence that followed was deafening. Laura looked at him as if begging for an explanation, but Daniel had no more words. He turned and left, leaving her behind, lost among the curious and judgmental looks of the guests. But as he walked out of the hall, something made him stop. There was something in her eyes, something deeper than guilt or regret. Something that seemed to hide an even bigger secret, something he wasn't prepared to discover. Daniel spent the night awake. After the scene at the party, he returned home as if he were walking through an endless tunnel, with the echoes of what he had just witnessed still resonating in his mind. Every detail of Laura's face, every expression of panic and despair was engraved like a tattoo that he couldn't erase. The image of the lover retreating, trying to disappear into the crowd, also wouldn't leave his head. He wanted answers. I needed them. But at the same time, I knew I was about to open a door that I could no longer close. And that idea terrified him. The silence in the house seemed to scream. Each room brought back memories of moments that now seemed distant, almost unreal. The smell of her perfume was still in the air, mixed with the coffee he had prepared himself that morning. Everything seemed so normal and yet so devastatingly different. He sat on the sofa, looking at the phone, waiting for Laura to call, to explain, to beg, but the device remained silent. When he finally heard the sound of the door opening, he felt his heart race. She entered slowly, as if expecting to be greeted with shouts and accusations, but she met only his gaze, cold and calculated. She closed the door, took a deep breath and tried to say something, but he raised his hand, interrupting her. He asked, in a firm and controlled voice, how long it had been going on. Laura stuttered, tried to look away, but he insisted, repeating the question. She finally admitted that she had started months ago, but said it didn't mean anything, that she was confused, that she was needy, that it was just a mistake. Daniel laughed, a bitter, incredulous laugh, wondering if that seemed like a mistake. He confronted her about the details, about the messages, the odd hours, the meetings disguised as meetings. Laura tried to justify it, saying that she felt alone, that he was always busy, but he cut her off, saying that none of that justified what he had done. Silence took over for a moment, but Daniel couldn't take it. He asked who that man was, what he represented. Laura hesitated before answering, and it was at that moment that he realized there was more. She began to cry, asking him not to hate, to listen before jumping to conclusions. But Daniel was already at his limit. He demanded that she speak, that she say at once what she was hiding. Laura closed her eyes, took a deep breath and finally revealed. The man she was involved with was not just a lover. It was someone Daniel knew. Someone close. A friend. The name made his blood run cold. It was someone who frequented their house, who had shared dinners, conversations, confidences. Daniel felt as if the ground had disappeared, as if everything around him was falling apart. He asked how this had happened, how she had been able to betray not only her marriage but also his trust in such a cruel way. Laura said it all started innocently enough, casual conversations that became more intimate until, before she knew it, she was too involved to stop. She tried to justify it by saying that she felt seen, valued, but Daniel could only think about what an idiot he had been made of. He asked if that meant she wanted to be with the other man, but Laura denied it. She said she wanted to save the marriage, that she was willing to do anything to fix what was broken. Daniel laughed again, this time more bitterly, saying that there was no way to repair what was destroyed. But something in her eyes made him hesitate. There was more. He knew. And that's when Laura, in tears, confessed the truth he could never have imagined. Her lover was not only someone close to her, but he had also taken advantage of her in a way that went beyond the emotional. He was blackmailing her. He used compromising messages, photos and intimate details to keep her trapped in that relationship. He said that if she broke up, it would destroy her reputation, her career, and even harm Daniel. She was terrified, trapped in a trap she didn't know how to escape. Crying, she begged Daniel to understand, to see that she had tried to leave, but couldn't. Daniel was silent, processing everything. I felt anger, disgust, but also pity. He saw genuine fear in her eyes, the desperation of someone who had lost control. He asked why she hadn't told him sooner, why she had let everything get so far. Laura said she was afraid he wouldn't believe it, that he would think she was just trying to justify herself. And in that moment, Daniel realized that, despite everything, he still cared. He still wanted to protect her, even if part of him wanted to just run away and never look back. He asked her what she wanted him to do, but Laura said she didn't know. I just wanted it to end. I wanted to go back to who I was before all this started. Daniel felt a mixture of anger and determination rise within him. I knew I couldn't just let it go. I knew I needed to face the situation, even if it meant diving even deeper into pain and betrayal. And it was at that moment that he decided that he wouldn't let that man destroy anything else in his life. Laura tried to get closer, holding his hand, but Daniel pushed her away, saying that, despite wanting to protect her, he needed time to decide what to do. He left home that night, driving aimlessly, feeling the weight of everything he had just discovered. His head was in a whirl, alternating between anger, hurt and the desperate need to find a solution. But deep down, I knew that this battle was just beginning. And the worst was yet to come. Daniel drove for hours that night, without a defined destination, trying to escape the whirlwind of thoughts racing through his mind. Laura's words echoed like a broken record. Bribery. Fear. Blame. He gripped the steering wheel tightly, feeling the tension run through every muscle in his body. Car headlights passed him like figures, but nothing seemed real. It was like he was trapped in a nightmare that he couldn't wake up from. When he finally stopped, he realized he was in front of a small bar away from the center. He went in, ordered a double whiskey and sat in a corner, trying to find some answer in alcohol or, at least, some silence for his mind. As he looked at his almost empty glass, he heard his cell phone vibrate in his pocket. It was Laura. He ignored the call, but the phone kept insisting until, angrily, he answered. Her voice was shaky, desperate. He said he needed to see him, that something had happened. Daniel hesitated, but something in her tone made him quickly pay the bill and leave. When he got home, he found Laura sitting on the sofa, her eyes swollen from crying. She got up immediately upon seeing him and ran to him, grabbing his arm as if he were her only salvation. He pulled away a little, still resentful, but asked what had happened. Laura said her lover had shown up at their house earlier, drunk and aggressive. She tried to send him away, but he refused to leave, saying he knew she was thinking about telling Daniel everything and threatening to release the compromising messages and photos. Daniel felt his blood boil, but he remained calm and asked her to tell him exactly what had happened. Laura said that when she managed to lock herself in her room, he banged on the door for endless minutes before finally leaving. She didn't know if he would come back and she was terrified. Daniel paced the room, trying to process everything. The hatred within him grew with every detail. He asked why she had let that man get so close, why she hadn't stopped him sooner. Laura tried to explain, but he interrupted her. He said he needed to resolve this once and for all. He took her cell phone and started looking for the messages, but Laura stopped him, saying that she had already deleted everything. Daniel didn't believe it, but he realized that forcing her wouldn't change anything. I needed to act. He took the car keys and said he would go after the man, but Laura begged him not to do that. He said he was dangerous and that everything could get worse. He ignored her pleas and left, driving towards the address he managed to find in the old messages that Laura hadn't deleted. When he arrived, he saw the man's car parked in front of a modest house. He got out of the car and knocked hard on the door. The man opened it, looking surprised, but quickly smiled arrogantly when he recognized Daniel. Before he could speak, Daniel pushed him inside, closing the door behind him. The atmosphere became heavy, and the two stared at each other for a long moment before the man opened his mouth to provoke him. He said Laura came to him first, that it wasn't his fault she was unhappy in her marriage. Daniel controlled himself so as not to explode. He asked about the messages, about the threats, and the man just laughed, saying that he had enough evidence to ruin Laura and that he wouldn't hesitate to use it if Daniel tried anything against him. It was at that moment that Daniel realized that he was not just dealing with a traitor, but someone manipulative and unscrupulous. He tried to argue, but the man seemed to feed on Daniel's despair. He said that Laura never really loved him, that she was just with him out of comfort, and that Daniel needed to accept that. Daniel lost control and lunged at him, pushing him against the wall. He demanded that he delete everything, but the man just smiled, saying he had nothing to lose. Before Daniel could react again, the man's phone rang. It was Laura. He answered on speaker, letting Daniel hear her voice begging him not to hurt Daniel, saying she would do anything to keep it a secret. The humiliation of hearing his wife beg for another man made Daniel recoil. He left the house without saying anything else, feeling defeated. When he returned home, he found Laura sitting in the living room, waiting for him. She ran to him, asking if he was okay, but he pushed her away, saying he needed time to think. Laura tried to explain once again, but he didn't want to hear it. He went to his room, closed the door and finally allowed the tears he had been holding back to fall. The pain of knowing he had been betrayed and manipulated was unbearable, but what hurt most was realizing that he still cared. Part of him wanted to protect her, wanted to find a way to fix everything, but another part was screaming at him to leave her and move on. The next morning, he woke up to the sound of his phone ringing. It was Laura, saying that the man had sent another message, this time demanding money in exchange for silence. Daniel felt his stomach drop. I knew it wouldn't end until I faced the problem head-on. He asked Laura to set up a meeting with him, saying she would make the payment. Laura hesitated, but ended up agreeing. When the time came for the meeting, Daniel stood at a distance, watching as Laura handed over the money. But before the man could leave, Daniel appeared, took the man's cell phone and threw it on the floor, crushing it with his foot. The man was furious and attacked Daniel, but this time he was prepared. The two fought, exchanging punches, until Daniel managed to immobilize him. He picked up his broken cell phone and told him that if he tried anything again, he would have to deal with the police. The man laughed, saying that he already had copies of the files, but Daniel replied that there was more evidence against him than against Laura and that he would not hesitate to expose everything. The man finally gave in, took the money and left, leaving Daniel and Laura alone in the parking lot. They returned home in silence. Laura tried to thank her, but Daniel didn't respond. He felt empty, exhausted, as if he had lost something he could never get back. I knew the battle was far from over, but at that moment I just wanted to rest and try to understand what was coming next. Laura approached him, touched his face and told him she loved him, but Daniel didn't respond. He just looked at her, trying to find some truth in her eyes, something he could hold on to continue. But all he saw was a reflection of his own pain. Daniel spent the next few days in a daze. The images of that night continued to invade his mind, the punches exchanged, the threats, Laura's voice begging her lover to leave everything behind. He felt he had won a battle, but not the war. That man's presence still hung like a shadow over everything he and Laura had built. Even after destroying the cell phone and physically facing the enemy, there was a part of him that knew that this was not the end. Something inside him said that this man wouldn't give up so easily. As he watched Laura in the kitchen, trying to act as if things could go back to normal, he realized that this normality was just an illusion. The look in her eyes, even when she tried to smile, carried a guilt too heavy to ignore. Daniel wondered if he would ever be able to look at her without remembering everything that had happened. Laura tried her best to fill the empty spaces. She prepared elaborate dinners, filled the house with flowers and perfumes that he once loved but now seemed suffocating. She touched him like someone desperately seeking to reconnect, but Daniel withdrew. Each approach was like a reminder of what had been lost. She told him she loved him, that she would do anything to make things right, but he couldn't respond. He just looked at her with a mixture of pain and frustration. Deep down, he wanted to believe, he wanted to accept that there was still something there to be saved, but the distrust was like an open wound that he couldn't ignore. The nights were the worst. Daniel slept on the sofa, claiming to need space, but the truth was that he couldn't bear to share a bed with Laura. Her smell on the pillow bothered him, bringing up images he didn't want to see. She cried in her room, but he didn't go there. He stood there, looking at the ceiling, trying to decide if there was anything left worth fighting for. At times, he felt guilty, as if he were punishing Laura for something she was already paying dearly for, but at others, the anger returned with force, reminding him that she had chosen that. She could have said no. I could have asked for help before letting things get this far. Laura began spending more time outside, claiming she needed space to deal with everything that had happened. Daniel didn't question it. Partly, he felt relief at not having to face the awkward silence that took over the house when they were together. But at the same time, her absence made him imagine the worst. He found himself checking her cell phone when she wasn't around, looking for any sign that her lover was still around. But he found nothing. Even so, distrust did not leave him. He felt like he was trapped in an endless cycle of doubt and resentment. One night, Laura arrived later than usual. She was visibly nervous, pacing around the house as if looking for something to say, but not having the courage to start. Daniel noticed and asked directly what had happened. She hesitated, but ended up confessing that her lover had tried to get in touch again. She said he found her leaving work and made further threats, demanding more money. Daniel felt his stomach drop. He asked why she hadn't told him sooner, but Laura said she was afraid he'd lose control again. Daniel remained silent, trying to contain his anger. I knew I couldn't act impulsively again, but I also knew I couldn't continue living in that situation. He asked Laura to block the number and avoid any contact. He said that this time he would involve the police if necessary. Laura agreed, but Daniel saw the fear in her eyes. I knew she wasn't being completely honest. I knew there was something more she wasn't telling him. That night, he decided to follow Laura after work. I needed to make sure she was really willing to cut ties with her lover. His heart was pounding as he watched her from afar, parked across the street. Laura left the office and, instead of going straight home, walked to a nearby cafe. She sat at a table in the corner and looked at her cell phone nervously. A few minutes later, the man appeared. Daniel felt his blood boil, but he forced himself to wait. He watched as they talked. Laura seemed to be begging, gesturing with her hands and lowering her head. The man, on the other hand, maintained a smug smile, leaning on the table as if he was in complete control of the situation. At one point, he held her hand, and Daniel almost lost control, but he continued to watch. When he finally saw Laura get up and hurried away, he waited until the man left as well before following him. The confrontation took place in a nearby alley. Daniel caught him by surprise, pushing him against the wall and demanding that he leave Laura alone. The man laughed, saying that Laura would always come back to him, that she had never really stopped wanting to be with him. Daniel exploded, shouting that it was over, but the man continued to provoke, saying that Laura never told the whole truth. That there was more that Daniel didn't know. Daniel pressed him against the wall, demanding that he speak, but the man just laughed and said that, sooner or later, Laura would reveal everything. Daniel returned home that day feeling defeated. Laura was sitting in the living room, waiting for him. When he walked in, she immediately knew something was wrong. He asked where he had been, but Daniel just said he knew about the meeting at the cafe. She tried to explain herself, saying that she was trying to convince him to leave them alone, but Daniel no longer knew what to believe. He asked directly what else she was hiding. Laura hesitated, but this time he didn't back down. He said he wouldn't leave until she told him everything. She started crying, saying she was scared, that she didn't know how he would react. Daniel asked her to trust him, to be honest once and for all. Laura finally relented, revealing that she had made bank transfers to her lover to try to keep him quiet. He said he had taken part of their savings, money that was reserved for travel and future plans. Daniel was in shock. He asked how much, and Laura revealed the amount, which was much higher than he expected. He felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. In addition to the emotional betrayal, there was now also a breach of financial trust. He asked how she could do this without talking to him, but Laura kept saying that she was desperate, that she just wanted to get it over with. Daniel felt a mixture of anger, hurt and despair. I didn't know how to get out of that situation, how to fix what already seemed irreparable. But deep down, I knew I couldn't continue living in that uncertainty. He knew he needed to make a decision, even if it was the most difficult of his life. And as he looked at Laura, he realized that she was also waiting for this answer. Daniel spent the night awake again, but this time there were no more doubts or uncertainties in his mind. Sitting in the living room armchair, he watched the reflection of the dim lights in the window as silence took over the house. Laura slept in the room, exhausted after yet another argument filled with tears and empty promises. But he knew there was nothing more to be said. The words had lost their weight, as had the apologies and requests for forgiveness. The love that once brought them together now seemed like a distant shadow, something he could barely recognize. What remained between them was a suffocating mix of pain, resentment and distrust, and Daniel finally accepted what he had been fighting against for so long. He needed to move on. He needed to leave that behind before he lost himself completely. As the sun began to rise, he went up the stairs and entered the room. Laura woke up to the noise and looked at him with tired, fearful eyes. He stood there for a moment, just watching, trying to memorize her face before all that. Then, finally, he said what he had been rehearsing all night. He said there was no way to continue, that trust had been destroyed and that no amount of effort could fix what was broken. Laura begged, cried, held his hands and said she would do anything to change, but Daniel remained firm. He said he didn't want revenge, he didn't want shouting or arguments. I just wanted peace. He said she could keep the house for now, but that he would be leaving that morning. He picked up a suitcase that was already packed and left before she could say anything else. The cold wind bit his face as he walked to his car, feeling lighter than he expected. It was not a happy relief, but a bitter release. He knew that the next few weeks would be difficult, he knew that the emptiness he felt now would be replaced by anger, sadness, and regret, but he also knew that he could no longer live trapped in this pain. As he drove without a clear destination, he began to think about what he would do next. I needed to start over, but, above all, I needed to learn to trust again, even if it took time. Laura, on the other hand, sat on the edge of the bed for hours, holding her phone, waiting for a message or a call that never came. She knew she had lost Daniel, she knew her actions had destroyed everything they had built together, but reality only hit her hard when the silence became unbearable. Tried to send messages, but he didn't respond. Tried to call, but calls were ignored. Finally, she realized that he was truly gone and that nothing she said could bring him back. Over the next few days, Laura tried to pick up the pieces of what was left of her life. She temporarily moved to a friend's house, unable to bear the emptiness of that house without Daniel. She tried to focus on her work, but her mind kept coming back to him, to what they had lost and to the wrong choices she had made. He thought about seeking professional help, but each attempt to move forward felt like a reminder of his failure. She knew she needed to find a way to forgive herself, but the guilt consumed her every day. Meanwhile, Daniel began to rebuild his life. He found a small but cozy apartment and began to focus more on work. He spent the days busy, but the nights were still lonely. It wasn't until she started attending a running group that she met someone who brought a new lease of life. Mariana was different from Laura in every way. He had a light, sincere smile, a contagious energy, and a simplicity that made Daniel feel comfortable for the first time in months. They started out as friends, but over time, something more started to grow between them. For the first time, Daniel felt like he could trust again, even with the scars he carried. But the past was not yet completely buried. Laura's ex-lover was still hanging around, trying to find ways to harm Daniel. In a last act of desperation, he tried to expose the compromising messages and photos, but ended up being reported for harassment and extortion. Laura collaborated with the police, providing all the necessary evidence, and the man was sentenced to serve time for his crimes. It was a humiliating end for someone who believed he had control over others, but for Daniel, it was just a reminder of how everything could have been avoided. Laura moved on, but was never able to completely let go of the guilt. She tried to start a new relationship, but the fear of repeating the same mistakes kept her stuck in the past. Although he rebuilt his career and regained some of his self-esteem, he always felt Daniel's absence like a wound that never completely healed. She knew she had lost him forever and that no amount of apology or regret could change that. Daniel, after months of uncertainty, finally allowed himself to believe in love again. Mariana brought a new perspective to his life, someone who made him realize that the scars of the past didn't need to define his future. They began to plan a life together, but Daniel never forgot the pain he experienced. He used this pain as a lesson, promising himself that he would never ignore the signs again, that he would always put himself first when it came to protecting his heart. The end of that story wasn't perfect, but it was real. It was about losses and new beginnings, about the weight of choices and the inevitable consequences. It was about betrayal, pain and redemption. And in the end, it was about finding the strength to move forward, even when everything seemed lost. If you made it this far, leave your comment and tell us what you thought of this story. Your opinion is very important. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to follow more impactful stories like this. And remember, this channel does not support any type of cheating. Betrayal destroys lives, and our stories show exactly how that happens. Until next time.